Hello, everyone. This is Pastor Alan Hathaway. I'm glad you joined me for this service today. I want to talk to you a little bit about what it means to be called to minister. I am struck by that very often when I look at the difference in cultures. I grew up eating fairly normal American foods. Pizza and hoagies and hamburgers and all those kind of things that are normal, roast beef, all of that kind of stuff that is normal. But if I'd grown up in a different part of the world, my food choices would have been very different. They would have been determined somewhat based on what was available to eat and somewhat based on what was culturally acceptable to eat. And those things are interesting to me. I have tried to expand my palate and what I eat and what I choose to eat. But I was thinking back a little bit over some of the more exotic things I've tried, and I realized that I haven't really had that extravagant of an experience with different foods. Actually, my kids are much more adventuresome in that area than I am. But I thought about how important this thing of being willing to try something different and new is for us. Part of the change of the gospel was the change that it brought into the world. The gospel was birthed in the Jewish culture around in the first century, when it was a very, very strict culture. It had come out of the exile period and developed a very intense sense of cultural unity because of the threat of Rome and the threat of the Greek culture around it. And so there was an intensity to that culture and a sense of absolute rightness to it. And very often we can develop that same attitude about our culture, can't we? We can think that we are absolutely right and that God absolutely thinks the way we think. And it can be quite a shock when we discover He doesn't necessarily think the way we think about certain things. Jesus is sending out the 72, and He sends them out with a commission that would later on impact Christianity and particularly Christian missions in the early 1900s. Christian missionaries in that period of time would begin to realize that they had a responsibility to enculturate into the cultures that they lived in and among the people they ministered to. And it changed the way in which mission work was done in Christianity. It also has impacted us. Jesus puts it rather simply for His disciples in Luke chapter 10, beginning in verse 7. He tells His disciples to remain in the same house where you first arrived, eating and drinking what the people there provide, for the laborer deserves his wages. He also tells them not to go from house to house. Whenever you enter a town and they receive you, eat what is set before you. Heal the sick in it and say to them, the kingdom of God has come near to you. And then He goes on to tell them if they are not received, they need to shake off the dust of their feet. He closes out His statement to them in verse 16 by saying something rather profound. The one who hears you hears me, and the one who rejects you rejects me, and the one who rejects me rejects Him who sent me. Very often what happens to us is we believe that when people reject our culture, our ideas, our way of thinking, that they are rejecting Christ and they are rejecting the message. That's when we don't separate the message from the calling and the purpose of Christ in us. The Apostle Paul would bring this home to the Gentile believers when he would talk to them about the fact that he, as a Jewish man who had grown up in a very strictly Jewish home and had grown up in a very strict understanding of the Jewish faith, had branched out to understand that the Gentile people were called to Christ just as much as he was. He had learned that from the Apostle Peter and his experience in reaching out to a centurion named Cornelius. Paul also understood that God was not concerned so much that people follow the dietary laws of the Jewish people or follow the dress codes of the Jewish people or follow the procedures that the Jewish people followed in the washing of their hands and the proper procedures that they followed in that. He understood instead that Christ had called these Gentiles to be Christians, to be followers of Christ. And what was most important was their relationship with Jesus Christ and their calling to follow him. That is what drives us forward. A Christian is someone who has accepted the lordship of Jesus Christ, who has allowed him to be Lord of his or her life. And when we do that, it means that we must give up some things. There were a lot of things about the Roman culture that were sinful, that were evil, that were destructive. But there were also many things that were good and would be later incorporated into the whole concept of a Western culture under the direction of Christianity. There were also things that would come into Christianity and into Western culture from the Germanic peoples that would conquer the Roman Empire. There were also things that would be brought into the Christian culture that was forming in the West from the Celtic people. And as Christianity has interacted and touched the lives of people, it has brought those things into the culture, into the understanding. And sometimes it meant that we had to jettison some ideas and some prejudices and some thought processes that were wrong in our history. I'm struck by a particular fruit. I like citrus fruits. As I was looking into them, I discovered that all citrus fruits developed from three basic types. Those three basic types have cross-pollinated and hybridized either through selection by farmers or in nature. The grapefruit tree, actually, the citrus trees were brought to the New World probably by Columbus and later explorers, but they quickly grew and developed in South America and in Central America, and they began to hybridize and cross-pollinate, and grapefruits were actually something that developed here in the New World. They developed from a previous citrus tree called a pomelo, but it is something unique in the circumstances of this new world. It was changed by the uprooting and the growing, and I thought about how we change and develop. The navel orange was developed here in the United States. It was found and developed as a cross hybrid that was developed from other orange trees. And so those things happen as Christianity cross-pollinates through cultures. There are wonderful things that happen and develop as a result of that work and as the gospel works through our cultures. None of our cultures are perfect. None of them are great. None of them are without fault and without problem. But when the gospel touches a culture, it takes what is best and transforms it for the good. And that's really what Christ wants to do in our lives. He He wants to transform each of us. Now, that doesn't mean that one Christian is going to look like another, is even going to think like another Christian. They may have very different culture, very different language, very different foods that they like. As Jesus said, when you sit down at table, respect the person at the table with you. I was struck by a scene from an old movie that I watched when I was a teenager on television. It was released in 1938, and it was actually the movie that kind of started Jimmy Stewart as a leading man. But it was called Of Human Hearts, and I was struck by it. It was a melodrama, and after World War II, that culture kind of changed. But prior to that, there was a real concern about that. And it's actually the story of a frontier minister who was a circuit rider and his family, particularly the relationship between he and his wife and their son, Jason. Jason is a young man with tremendous intelligence, ability, and skill. But he is a self-centered young man, a man who thinks only of himself pretty much. And as a result of that, he grows up having this fascination with medicine and wanting to become a doctor. He, as a young man, travels with his dad on one of his circuits as a minister, and he is disgusted by the poverty that he sees among the people that his father is ministering to, and he is offended and upset when he is at a elderly widow's home and she feeds him mush, and because of her inattention, a frog gets in the mush that she is preparing, and he is horrified when his father, in order not to embarrass the elderly lady, eats the frog in his mush so he doesn't embarrass his host. He is further angered and frustrated when the elderly woman, in an act of kindness, gives him a coat that belonged to her husband, and she wants to bless him with this, and he is angered and frustrated by this tattered coat that he sees as offensive to him. And he and his father get into a serious fight over this, about the importance of not offending people. And that whole scene really made an impression on me as a teenager when I saw it for the first time. I thought about how important it is that we not offend people. Jesus would say that if we offend even one of these little ones who have come to him, that it would be better for us to have a millstone tied around our neck and thrown into the sea. Paul would say, I have learned to become all things to all men, so that by all means I might win some to Christ. In other words, it's not so important that we uphold our culture as that we hold up Christ to this world. So I'm not always as adventuresome as an eater as I should be. And I would hope that if I visit another part of the world and am invited to sit down at table with somebody, that I would have the good grace to, if necessary, eat a frog. I would hope that would be part of me, because I hope that I would be more concerned about not offending a person who Christ loves. And that is important in all of our lives. We are called to minister. And part of that is to be people of courtesy, people of courage, people of service, and people who are confident. And those things are what Christ tried to instill in his disciples and what he still tries to instill in each of us. God bless you. Thank you for listening. Hope to see you in church.